It's final assembly time. This is where all the fun starts to happen. So when I tore this engine apart, I pulled all the plugs out for the machine shop to do all their cleaning and stuff and get everywhere they need to go. And I labeled everything, and I actually got smart this time and took notes and made this kind of treasure map of where all these plugs and bolts go on the block. Now I didn't clean these bolts when I pulled them off because I have the numbers and stuff kind of written on some of them, especially the plugs. So now that we're installing them, I'm going to clean them as I go, one at a time, so I know 100% that that's where that bolt should go. And you can use Teflon tape if you want to. These cast iron blocks, they will get pretty hot. Even if your temp gauge is reading 200 degrees or so, that's pretty hot. That's way hotter than your household water, which is what Teflon tape was originally meant for. Plus, the factory didn't use Teflon tape on any of these plugs. They used the pipe dope, which is basically the goop. I'm not sure it's actual plumber's pipe dope or if it's a specialized one. That I don't know. Google it, let me know. But I'm gonna use this high temp thread sealant from Permatex. You just apply this to the threads just like you would with Loctite or even the pipe dope. And I like to keep it away from the first couple of threads. That way it stays in the threads. It doesn't go inside your engine. So this is P2, which is this big water jacket plug here on the driver's side of the engine towards the rear. And this is a big old 17mm hex socket. If you don't have one this big, you can always find a bolt that goes in there and put a bolt and a nut together, just snug. Then we'll just repeat that process for all the other bolts and all the other plugs. Keep moving on. All right, now it's time to install the pistons, and in order to do that, we got to get this crank journal at bottom dead center, which means we need to spin the crank. As we move along and install more pistons, this is going to get harder and harder to turn. So this is where you want to install a piston crank turner tool thing up at the snout, but I don't got one of those and I don't feel like buying one. So here's a little trick. You can go ahead and install all 6 of your flywheel bolts at the back of the crank, and then you can use a pry bar or a long screwdriver and just stick it in between opposite bolts, and it makes it much easier to turn. So one last time, we'll clean the rod journal with some mineral spirits and a lint-free cloth. And now we'll go ahead and rub some assembly lube on the crank. And you also want to get it kind of up on the sides. That's where the side of your rods are going to run. Assembly lube is cheap. Might as well put it everywhere. Give it a turn to get the back side of that. So now we'll flip the engine so that the driver's side cylinder bank is as horizontal as possible. This will make it much easier to use gravity to help us fit that piston into the bore. And again, one last time, we'll clean the cylinder walls with some mineral spirits. And then we'll go ahead and lube the cylinder walls with just a light coat of oil. Sometimes a little bit of dirt can get lodged in all the cross hatches. So it's at this point we want to keep wiping until we get no residue on our rag. See all that came off just with the engine oil. Now we're coming out clean. Pretty happy with that. Good enough. So now we'll take our number 1 piston here and we'll go ahead and clean this again, especially where the rings are and the skirts. So now we got to lube this guy up. We're going to put some oil on the rings and on the side of the pistons and the skirts. Just using motor oil and a brush for this. Again, motor oil is cheap. You want that crap everywhere. Now we can take our rod cap off. We'll clean it and then we'll lube it with some assembly lube. Don't forget the sides of the rods. Basic concept with lube, especially when you're assembling these, is anywhere metal is going to touch, that's what you want to lube. Because when you initially fire this thing up, you don't want any metal to metal contact. I'm good with that. I've got this old school band style ring compressor. So once you got your rings kind of clocked in place, I like to go from the bottom. That way I can kind of squeeze it. Go. You're gonna go all the way until the bottom part of your skirt is exposed. Now we can tighten it, and now we're ready to install it in the block. Now you of course want these to go the right direction, so when you install these, you gotta look for the notch on your piston, or maybe there's a dot or maybe an arrow or something, but that goes towards the front of the motor, so make sure you got it going the right direction. So now you want to lightly tap this into the cylinder with the butt of your hammer. Make sure you have a friend or use your other hand to catch the rod as it's going in. That way you don't scratch your journals on your crank. Just like that. and then slowly work the rod onto the crank. Being super careful not to nick anything on the journals. Now we'll put some of this ARP Ultra Torque Lube on our rod bolts. We'll install our cap. We have to make sure it's going the right direction, so you match up the ears on the rod with the ears on the cap. We'll just get these hand tight for now, just to hold the cap and rod together. So now we just got to do all the other 7 pistons. Alright, now we're going to torque all these rod caps, and since that pre-assembly video I finally got smart and bought me one of these digital torque wrenches that also does angles. Now that angle finder I was using works really well, but being in a wheelchair I couldn't see the needle very well, so it was hard to get it exactly on the right angle setting, and trying to hold it and hope it doesn't turn, and I don't have good ab strength so I couldn't balance very well, and so I got this torque wrench from Hobo Fright. And you know, if you've seen any of my other videos, I've been pretty critical about Hobo Fright, but apparently all the negative reviews have actually worked because they've actually gotten a lot better over the last few years, all because of me. But in all the reviews and videos I've watched, this one actually outperformed all of them in accuracy and quality, and not to mention the price. So I'm crossing my fingers, knocking on wood, I'm not going to get burned again by Mr. Hobo Fright. These rod bolts have to be torqued in sequence. The first pass is going to be 15 foot-pounds, and then we're going to go an additional 85 degrees. Now the old rod bolts were 75 degrees, but for 2002, if you get the newer style rod bolts from GM, just like I did, you got to go 85 degrees. So I'm just going to start with number 5 here, since this is the one that's up. I'm going to set this to 85 degrees. There we go. So we'll do the next one. So this should be number 4, 6. 5, 6. Yep, 6. I was good at math. Right there. And just like we did on those main caps, when you're done torquing these down, it's a good idea to mark the bolts with a paint pen. That way you know you torqued them down, and you're not second guessing yourself, you didn't miss anything, you don't over torque anything, you're good to go. Now it's time to turn our attention to the front of the engine. We're going to install the timing set and the oil pump. And as you recall from the first video on this motor, when I tore it down, that timing chain was wore out. 260-some thousand miles. It lasted a long time, but man, it needed to be replaced. So first we'll attach the lower gear onto the crank, but before we put it on, we're going to soak this a little bit with some penetrating fluid just to kind of help it go on a little easier. It's a good idea to clean all your parts when you install them too, so we'll clean the sprocket before we put it on there. And then obviously you want to line up the little keyway, and then you can use the old sprocket to kind of help hammer it on. And you're just going to listen for the sound. You want to hear it kind of get to a high-pitched ping, and that way you know it's all the way seated. It's probably the same on yours, but the little keyway, it's not all the way flush with the sprocket. That's how it was from the factory, so we're good. Now we want to turn the sprocket until our number 1 cylinder is at top dead center, and then we'll put the camshaft sprocket on. You'll also see on this sprocket there's a little dimple. That's how you know that is top dead center. It's really hard to screw this up because you see it's got the 3 holes and the thing for the pin here on your camshaft. This also has a mark right there, is what you want to line up with your mark on your sprocket. That way you know your timing set is correct. So we'll just line those marks up like so. And before we install the sprocket, it's a good idea just to kind of put some oil on the back part of it because this is a movable piece. I'm even going to rub a little bit on the retainer plate as well, just because, probably not necessary, but you know, oil's cheap, wearing out parts, causing heat. Not good. Put the chain on the sprocket. Remember to hold your camshaft in place because we don't have the back cover on there yet, and this camshaft could walk out the back of the motor if we're not careful. And then these will get torqued to 26 foot-pounds, and you may need to block the crank to keep it from spinning, or just have a friend of yours hold it with the pry bar. And there we go. Check it off the list. All right, let's install our oil pump now. Now there are things that you can do to your old oil pump to kind of rebuild it, make it a little bit better performance, things like porting some of the stuff on the inside to make it high volume, and you can actually add some washers to the spring to give it more pressure. But remember, oil is the lifeblood of your engine. If you don't get oil where it needs to go, your engine will destroy itself from the inside out. So with 260,000 miles on this motor, I'm opting just to get a whole new oil pump because I don't want to pull this motor apart again. The one I got is the Melling M295HV, and this is the high volume one. And this oil pump also has a sacrificial ring in there that makes it self-centering. This is a little easier. Yeah, it costs money, but again, for my own peace of mind, I want to be safe, especially with the blood in the motor, the oil, or as my friends in Texas call it, Earl. You want to make sure you dump some motor oil down in there and spin it a few times. These get torqued to 18 foot-pounds. And there you go. All the internals of the bottom end are installed, and next time we're actually going to finish up the bottom end by installing the front cover and the rear cover and the oil pan. So I hope this helped you out. If it did, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, check out the socials down here, get yourself a t-shirt over here, and I'll see you on the next one.